You're at a wonderful school. We have within this very building, or even within the Jepson end of the building, we have computer science folks who are also use this space. We've got 7 different disciplines represented in the Jepson schools. I'm an economist myself, an historian of economic thought, and so it's a great pleasure to have you here. We have a very public series of events each year called the Jepson Leadership Forum. And this year the theme of that, we called it Where in the World Are We Going? And the theme is Leadership in International Context. This is this very academic and more private counterpart to that. And Doug and Thad have done a really great job putting together a group of people and papers on leadership and global justice. So I look forward to hearing some of the presentations. And I'm hoping that pretty soon we have PowerPoint ready so that I can stop talking. But even if it's not, I'm going to turn it over to Thad and just say welcome again. Thanks for coming.
Hi, I'm Thad Williamson from the Jepson School. I just want to make a few introductory comments about the motivation for the conference as a whole, maybe as much to the benefit of the people, our guests as well as participants, and then we'll get right into it. First, there's this obvious paradox that our concept of justice, as they have come to us in the traditional Western philosophy, originated in concepts of the polity in the city, and then later on the nation state, which we're all saying explicitly this is a model for justice in a self-contained nation. Yet when we look at the world, the most striking inequalities and the most striking instances of human suffering, and often the most striking instances of domination and power differences and violence often have a global dimension. And so it seems natural that there is a desire to try to figure out how to apply normative criteria to global phenomena. And that's what I think we're all committed to, that idea that it's possible. But the idea that possibility has serious difficulties that have to be addressed or transcended. For instance, the long tradition of realist thought, which suggests that collectivities, nation states are inevitably self-interested, essentially all the time, and the possibilities for justice or talk to powerful countries about justice is actually a form of hypocrisy. So we have in mind those kinds of concerns. There's also the concerns of who is the audience for discourse about global justice. Is it aimed at citizens? Is it aimed at other academics? Is it aimed at policymakers? Is it aimed at states? Is it aimed at NGOs? And to really do help to connect the thoughts about global justice here to that question, the practical part, the leadership stuff. Who's actually going to take these ideas and go and do something with it? And we'll be talking about at least one major practical issue, climate change, but certainly others will certainly arise. And I think that should be enough on the motivation. I guess the one other piece I would say is that the global justice questions before us, but the local and national justice questions don't go away either. I mean, maybe we can have some discussion about how those problems interact, because they often may be relevant, especially thinking about how to derive or develop political support for action on any of these issues. And the last comment I want to make is simply that we hope this will be a very productive conference, a working conference. We really want this to be a chance for the participants to sharpen their ideas and to improve each other's arguments. And we really want our time together to produce something that's going to be valuable. You know, not only have a good time together and new networks and relationships, but being a book that will be substantial and a major contribution to this field. So anyway, thanks everybody for being here. And we'll start with Gillian Brock, and then Mathias Risse. Or you're gonna go first? You're here.
You think I'm just standing around?
All right. Okay. Just say we told the participants we don't have time for discussion, and if you need up to 30 minutes, okay. Shorter would be better if possible, but certainly you have license to go to 30 minutes, and then we will cut you off. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Okay, so then let me jump right into it. So the instruction of the day has been to be fast, so I'll be fast and sketchy. I say this is a bit of a challenge for me to write this paper in the first place in a relatively short way, because this is material from chapter 18 of an 18-chapter book. So this is really coming really from the very end. So I will be sketchy with regard to the most substantive, philosophically most substantive parts, but given that this is a book in progress, this is also a bit of an advertisement for the book, so I hope this is okay that overdetermined anyway. So the background here, I explained this a little bit in the paper, the background for the book, and that's which in turn is the background for the theme of this paper, is the current situation in contemporary political philosophy. So the interesting situation there is that we have basically two standard views about which many people say neither one of them can be the plausible answer to the question of what justice amounts to at the global level. But the question then is what else is instead, right? So the two standard views that we have here, first is the idea that consideration of justice, principles of justice, really only apply within states, so we have to share a state to be in a justice relationship. And the response to that is cosmopolitanism, to say no, states really are at the fundamental level, they're not normatively relevant, they really at most serve instrumentally useful purposes. So the justice relationship really applies among everybody, right? So these are the two views that set the stage here. And then a lot of people have said, well, but both of these are implausible, and then the question is what else would be plausible? And my book, The Grounds of Justice, tries to put a picture in place here that identifies different grounds of justice, so roughly speaking, different contexts within which different principles of justice apply, and then depicts an overall picture of global justice that is put together out of these different grounds of justice, these different contexts of justice within which respectively different principles apply. And so the 5 grounds of justice that I distinguish, or the 5 settings within which particular principles of justice apply, are these here: shared membership in states is one, common humanity is one, shared involvement in the global trading system is one, shared membership in the global order, how they precisely differ doesn't matter, but it's also one. And one ground of justice that has greatly preoccupied me in recent years, and this is probably the part where my approach sounds strangest, right? Given that the overall approach in a way is a response to the state of the field, right? We do need some plausible intermediate theory here, but this is probably where my theory sounds strangest, when I'm trying to resurrect a thought that was the pivotal theme of the philosophy of the 17th century, but has since then fallen into much neglect, has been used a little bit recently by left libertarians, but has not been made much use of the idea that humanity collectively owns the planet Earth. So humanity's collective ownership is also a ground of justice. For example, the way common humanity enters here into those pictures of common humanity, I do acknowledge as a ground of justice. So cosmopolitans want to say shared humanity is all that ultimately matters for the applicability of principles of justice. I want to say common humanity is one in several grounds of justice. What you can do with that is you can derive a view of human rights out of that, right? So you can derive human rights from the idea of common humanity, a relatively constrained set of human rights which are meant to protect distinctively human life. And by an instrumental argument, you also get a duty of assistance. So what do we have to do for each other? Well, efforts have to go into providing assistance in building institutions, because that is what it takes to realize an environment in which these rights actually apply. So the idea of humanity's collective ownership of the Earth is one that I apply to topics such as these. This is not my topic for today, but one intuitive idea here that comes in: if we do collectively own the Earth, then it cannot be the case that any number of people can do whatever they like with any chunk of this, right? So there have to be constraints of what this many people can do with that amount of three-dimensional space, right? So, which leads pretty intuitively to ideas about immigration. So constraints of immigration are coming out of this. Then you can ask about what does this imply to entitlements that we have with regard to the use of particular parts of the commonly owned planet, so the atmosphere, for example. So there's a connection to climate change, and there's a connection to future generations, because if you have this idea that humanity collectively owns the Earth, then you also have to see we are not all around at the same time, right? So there's a diachronic dimension to this. So these are all topics that come out of this. So I like Rawls's principles of justice for the domestic context. So what we are getting out of this, picture of ground of justice, is basically if you use these as your starting point, you see that these grounds of justice require additions to these principles. So we need if you think about what this entails for the state, so we need a much more expansive list of principles, and in a way there's a geometrical idea here, kind of a geometrical image here in the background. So if you think about these different grounds of justice, they actually are, from the paper I have this terminology: principles of justice, ground of justice, scope of justice to people who are affected by these principles. So one ground of justice can be embedded into another, right? So if everybody in the scope that is associated with one ground is also in the scope associated with another ground, then one ground of justice is embedded into another one. So it's something very simple, such as this, right? So everybody in a state is in the central figure there, but then everybody, there's more people with whom, for example, they are jointly subject to the global trading system, right? So this is a larger scope. And then once you take this theory seriously, but after doing a lot of probing, you come to the result that principles of justice that hold in the larger scope also apply to the smaller entities, right? So what this means for the state is we can't just have principles of justice that apply merely within the state, but we must add to that principles of justice that are associated with grounds into which the state is embedded, right? Like the subjection to the trading system and collective ownership of the earth, for example, right? So, and then you're getting something much more complicated. All that this picture is now for, that you kind of look at that and you see there's a much longer list, right? There's a more complicated list of principles of justice that we can get to when we start with Rawls's two principles of justice and then add on all this material that one gets out of this grounds of justice picture. Right? That's where the theory is going. But today I want to talk about accountability. So what's the connection? Well, at some point when you think about global justice, you start thinking also about international organizations, right? You wonder how do they fit in, right? And once you start thinking about international organizations, you come to questions of accountability. And from the standpoint of a theory of global justice, this is easy to motivate. So basically what you're doing is you say, well, here's an entity, here's an institution. When you ask what ought this entity to do about justice, right? How do considerations of justice apply here? Then you can ask about two things, right? You can simply ask, what are the principles of justice that are relevant here? And you can also ask, well, if this institution, if this entity goes about realizing these principles of justice, is there also an obligation to account for what they're doing, right? That's the second question that comes in, and that's a question that becomes central when you're thinking about what is the relevance of international organizations in the context of a theory of justice. Now, there is an important theoretical connection now between the applicability of duties of justice, the sheer holding of obligations of justice, and the requirement of accountability. And that is I think a theoretically very important connection. That is one thing the paper argues for. So I offer two arguments there: an argument from respect and an instrumental argument for the conclusion that justice requires accountability. Right? Justice requires accountability. So if you have obligations, if there's an entity that has obligations of justice, including individuals, right, that does entail an obligation of also of giving account for that, right? And this is a conclusion that these two arguments establish what I think is a loose link between the ideas of justice and accountability. It's a loose link because it doesn't entail anything about the requirement of effective accountability, and there's nothing very specific coming out of this, but there is a link nonetheless between justice and accountability. And that, just to flag this, and you can press it a little bit further, you can say, depends on what the concrete case is, but there is these arguments from respect, and the instrumental argument do imply that one should try to make accountability as effective as reasonably possible in the context. And that, I think, is an important, just to flag this very clearly, I think this is an important argument, right? So if this is true, then this gives a lot of ammunition for the theorist of justice to say, look, here's an angle from which we can press for certain institutional reforms, because it is not enough to say that principles of justice also only apply. It is also important that there's an institutional framework within which the entities that have these obligations account for them, right? And that is, I think, a major angle for pushing for reforms. You know? Now we have the following situation. So we find ourselves in a state. A state has obligations of justice that apply only to its citizens, right, among its citizens. But it also has these other obligations of justice that apply. For example, obligations of justice that regulate how access to the atmosphere is governed, principles of justice that deal with future generations, but also principles of justice that apply to subjection to the global trade regime as a ground of justice, which are principles of fairness in trade, right? They all apply to the state. So the state now has the obligation, in virtue of these two arguments that I just referred to, of actually giving account for what it does about these principles, right? How does it go about the realization of this kind of justice? And that is a notoriously tricky thing, because if you think about the dynamics of domestic democracy, the domestic democracies, in virtue of their very functioning, always have strong incentives, governments always have strong incentives to prioritize principles of justice that hold among its citizens over other principles of justice, right? Just because the accountability mechanism that's most appropriate for domestic principles is precisely democracy, but then ipso facto you have, you know, inherent tendencies for governments to lose sight of the fact that they also have these other principles of justice, and democracy itself is not a good, domestic democracy itself is not a good accountability mechanism for that. So account giving nonetheless must happen there, right? So how should this happen, right? How should governments account for principles of justice other than those that apply domestically, for which democracy holds them accountable, right? How should they do that? Well, and that leads us to international organizations, right? So take the World Trade Organization. Right? So take the World Trade Organization, just like states, we can now ask about both what principles of justice apply to the World Trade Organization. We can ask also what kind of accountability, in which way should it be held accountable. And I do that in a moment. I do both of these things. But notice one thing, first of all, about the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization is an organization founded by states. States have these obligations of justice connected to trade, right? Which are principles of fairness in trade. So if we see that, then we also see there is a justice-based rationale to be had, right? For the existence of something like the World Trade Organization. There needs to be an international organization like the World Trade Organization, right? Why? Well, two things. So one thing, again, the dynamics of domestic politics make it very difficult for governments to give proper account for this, right? For principles of obligation of justice. So that means it's the account-giving function there for states is placed better in a transnational organization. And then we also see, given the global nature of trade, that it should be an organization of global reach, right? So if there weren't a World Trade Organization of sorts already, we should be founding one today, right? That is there's a justice-based rationale for that. Yeah? So now, how do principles of justice apply to the World Trade Organization? Well, principles of justice apply to the World Trade Organization away from two directions, right? They come from below, from the states that have founded the World Organization, and the reason for that is that states have these obligations. States found an organization specifically concerned with a subject area in which they have obligations of justice, so these obligations of justice get bequeathed from below to the World Trade Organization, right? But at the same time, the trading system of which the World Trade Organization is a part is also embedded, right? As a ground of justice is embedded into common humanity as a ground of justice, right? For example, that is why I mentioned the implication of common humanity earlier. So it's in virtue of this embeddedness relationship that all the obligations that apply in virtue of common humanity are also bequeathed to the, are also kind of passed down in this case, not be, but passed down to the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization in principle has a, following this reasoning, right, which again is very sketchy here, I'm not really giving anything like a semblance of an argument here, but the point of this is, once you take this picture of global justice, of grounds of justice seriously, the World Trade Organization actually comes out with an, in principle, very strongly development-oriented mandate, because we have this duty of assistance that came through association with common humanity as a ground of justice, right? So that's quite important, right? That justice applies to this organization in this way. So you can't just say, but the WTO is just an instrument for trade liberalization, right? You can't say that. That is ruled out by these arguments, right? At the same time, the World Trade Organization is also the only sensible place, given the spectrum of entities that we have these days, within which states can account, states must account for what they do about fairness in trade. The only sensible place, given the poverty of domestic politics for this purpose, and given reservations about anything like a global democratic system that I can't articulate, but do have, that I can't articulate here, but do have, the only sensible location for account giving for principles of justice is the trade-specific international organization. So it is the World Trade Organization, right? So two important things here about the World Trade Organization, right? So there's principles of justice that apply to it, right? Partly because they come from states, they're bequeathed from states, and partly because the World Trade regime is embedded into other grounds. So it is an entity, it is an organization that we must think of and that we must suitably reform as an agent of justice, and at the same time we must also suitably reform it as an entity within which states can actually give account, right, for what they themselves do. And at the same time, the World Trade Organization itself also must give account for what it does, right? So this is also, it applies one level higher up. And that also must happen ideally within its own confines, right? So the World Trade Organization must be arranged in such a way that that account giving for its own activities is possible, and that creates some strong pressure to integrate not just states into the World Trade Organization, the WTO being largely a state-driven organization anyway, but also other kinds of entities like NGOs that represent the world public in such a way that account giving can also happen for what the World Trade Organization itself does, right, rather than just what governments do respectively, right? So notice a contrast between this reasoning with regard to the World Bank and, between this reasoning with regard to the World Trade Organization and the World Bank. So I was invited a few months ago to the World Bank and they were asking me to think through what my theory implies for them. Where does this leave the World Bank? And I don't think they're going to invite me again in the near future. I didn't find this endearing what came out of this, because remember the rationale I had for why there has to be a World Trade Organization, right? There has to be one because there needs to be account giving for trade, for principles of fairness in trade, and trade is a global phenomenon. Right? It's globally interconnected, so it cannot be just a regional situation here and a regional situation there. There has to be a global organization. With the World Bank is basically the major development agency that we have, right? There's no parallel case. There doesn't need to be a worldwide operating organization of the sort. In fact, you might say, in hindsight, given what we have learned about development, or given what we realized we hadn't really learned, right? Given the diversity of views, it might be actually a good thing if there weren't one elephant in that room, but lots of tigers maybe, right? So different entities, right? So there's no particular need for a World Bank, right? But there is a justice-based rationale for a World Trade Organization. Okay, so so this is mostly what I want to say about that. This gives a blueprint for reform in the World Trade Organization. The paper says a little bit about that, how to go about that, right? There's problems about the way the World Trade Organization functions in terms of the exercise of informal power, right? How exactly is power exercised there? About the lack of representation of poorer members. And these arguments that I just gave of not only how principles of justice apply to the World Trade Organization, but how there's also this link between justice and accountability, right? That's the argument that does the work here. That demands reforms within the WTO, for example, to simply increase the standing of weaker members, right? So from here on, you can kind of start, to think more systematically, how can we reform the World Trade Organization so that weaker members have voices, as things like, many of the least developed countries are not even present at the WTO because they can't afford that, right? So here's a justice-based argument via accountability as to why this actually should be paid for by the rich countries to make sure these people are present there, so that rich countries can go about their obligation of account giving in that context, right? So I think as far as the World Trade Organization is concerned, there's some reasonably reasonably straight, as far as philosophical advice or reforms is concerned, right? Reasonably straightforward suggestions of what to do with the WTO. So one thought about leadership, since now I've been talking about global justice, one concluding and very pessimistic actually thought about about exercise of leadership. So if I had to mention 5 books that I think everybody should read, this one would definitely have to be on there. So Jared Diamond's Collapse has really moved me like almost no other book I've ever read. Can I just ask who has read this? Who has read this? Some of you. So the theme, the theme in this book is Diamond looks back at a number of civilizations that we have known over history that existed at some point in history, and then they disappeared. Right? These civilizations that disappeared. Now, in many cases, these were civilizations in rather remote locations, like Viking colonization in Greenland during the late Middle Ages, or the famous Easter Islands, right, with these enormous statues that are looking out into the Pacific Ocean. So these are cultures that existed for some time, and then they disappeared. But there were other cultures, right, in Central America that disappeared, not because of violent outside interference, but they just disappeared. And as Diamond argues, this is in almost all cases, basically in all cases that he looks at, it's because of environmental issues, right? So environmental issues make them disappear. Environmental issues that people at the time actually probably understood, right? They understood what was going on, but where they were politically incapable of dealing with them because there were vested interest that in the short term made it impossible for them to deal with them, even though they understood just fine what was going on, right? And so in a way, the point of this, of course, is to, for present purposes, is, in the larger scheme of things, we as humanity, the Earth as a whole, is like these civilizations, right, that existed for some point, and we are in the same situation. That's kind of it's a nice thing to point out to people. So as somebody who teaches at a policy school, I do point this out a lot to people, and it's actually stunning to me how difficult it is to bring across these ideas of, to suggest to people that genuine bridge building and non-standard approaches really are required here, so that we take on responsibility, so that we don't end up in a situation like this. So we at the Kennedy School have a thing called Spring Exercise, which is a 2-week intense set of sessions where students are charged with a particular task. So last time when we did this, they were put together in little groups, and their job was to prepare a memorandum for Hillary Clinton's visit to China, and to prepare her conversations with the Chinese leaders on labor rights and on the connection between labor rights and human rights and climate change. Right? So this was the charge. You had to prepare memos for that, and then different people give lectures on this and prepare them for this task. And I gave the ethics lecture, prepared something about ethical issues about climate change and the link between labor rights and human rights, and some really interesting recent work. And the point of this was always, given this sort of phenomenon, right, what we need here is global leadership, and you should be advising the secretary, right, Hillary Clinton. You should ask her to say to the Chinese, look, we get together, we Americans and we Chinese, if we do things in a certain way, to integrate things more, to, take leadership in climate change, and take leadership in labor issues, right? We can set standards and make the world better, right? So not a single group did anything other than advise the Secretary of State on a very narrow understanding of American foreign policy. Right? There was none of them took me up on this, and they'd all gone through our curriculum, they'd all gone through ethics courses, they'd all heard me bang on about this before, right? But not a single group, even in this mock exercise, right, did this just for the sake of doing this, right? So this must say, was a very serious blow for me, because it makes me think, if not even these students, right, who come to the Kennedy School forfeiting better paid careers and really want to change the career, are thinking like this, right? And they are even in a mock exercise advising the Secretary of State that, genuine forward-looking solutions, integrated thinking is possible to avoid scenarios like that. Then I'm very pessimistic as far as the exercise of global leadership for a change for the better is concerned. So on that negative note, I will take my leave here. Thank you.
So hold your questions or make a mental or written note of them, and we'll do the presentations consecutively and have all. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much to Doug and Thad and Nancy for organizing this event and for inviting me, and I look forward to a wonderfully stimulating conversation with you all about these important issues. We've been asked to identify key themes in our paper that connect with global justice and leadership, and coincidentally, my recent book, Global Justice, A Cosmopolitan Account, tackles various challenges to global justice and how to rebut these. So I'm very, very pleased to be able to talk to you about these global justice challenges, and more importantly, to bring to your attention some important responses that we have available to these legitimate skeptical concerns. So unlike Matthias's paper, I think mine's going to be quite optimistic. Well, I hope so, anyhow. I think leaders on global justice can anticipate two key kinds of questions about why they should pursue global justice. And I'm going to talk about these challenges in particular. And insofar as I provide responses to these legitimate worries, I think I can provide helpful resources to global leadership studies. Well, anyhow, that's the hope. So what are these two specific kinds of concerns that I think are so fundamental to global justice topics? I think there's two skeptical concerns that many people have about global justice, and one of these skeptical concerns is about the feasibility of global justice. It's all very well to come up with theoretical models of what global justice should be, but really how feasible is any of this in practice? And I think that is a legitimate concern people have, and I think we can tackle it quite well. The second major challenge that I think we can anticipate concerns how global justice will fit in with other people, with other legitimate aspirations people have and attachments that they have, in particular to their nations. So people worry that talk about global justice might undermine and interfere with nationalism or legitimate concern with national interests and goals. And in particular, they may worry that global justice will undermine self-determination or perhaps authentic democracy and other goals that are legitimate for nations to pursue. So those are the two kinds of skeptical concerns that I think require important responses, convincing responses. So I talked about the first one, I talk about the feasibility skeptic, and the second one I'm going to talk about, I just identify as the pro-nationalist skeptic. I'll just say a few words about some preliminaries that will help set us up to tackle these objections and these concerns more directly. So just some preliminaries. I do offer a full account of what I think global justice consists in, and my account, which is defended in the book in more detail, it basically argues that everybody is allowed, or everybody should be well positioned to enjoy prospects for a decent life. and I developed that account in terms of everybody being positioned to be enabled to meet their basic needs, to have their basic freedoms protected, to enjoy fair terms of cooperation in collective endeavors, and to have in place social and political arrangements that support these key goals of global justice. Okay, so that's just as a background concern, and if you want more about that, we can talk about it. I want to talk about feasibility skepticism in more detail first. There are actually at least 8 types of concerns you might have about feasibility, and I separate them out. And I'm going to just talk about these 8 different kinds of concerns about feasibility next. So skepticism about the feasibility of global justice is warranted, a skeptic might maintain, because there's a lack of understanding about what global justice consists in, or there's no consensus about what global justice goals are, what we should be aiming at. So that's a first concern. A second concern is that we won't be able to transition to any of these goals, even if we can identify or agree on what they should be. That's a second concern about transitioning to the goals. A third concern is about the fact that we don't know what works and what doesn't in trying to help people in the global sphere. In particular, we don't know enough about what will help them eliminate poverty. How do we do that? There's lots of debate about that one. A fourth concern is that we won't know whether we're making progress. Even if we think we're going in the right direction, how will we know? So a concern that we might be making things worse, that we might be trying various measures, but in fact we might be making the whole problem worse. A fifth concern is that it will be difficult to motivate people to pursue anything resembling global justice. There just isn't that kind of motivation in the global sphere. And the worry is that, especially in an environment where people perceive global justice to be counter to self-interest and counter to national interest, why would they pursue any sort of vision of global justice? A sixth concern is about there's a lack of institutions in the global sphere that have authority to secure or promote global justice. So concern there is that there's just no one who can actually secure this or promote global justice. There's no authority, legitimate authority at the global level that has that kind of power. And relatedly, a seventh concern is about how we would enforce any agreements that we reached, if we were lucky enough to reach some global agreements. In the absence of a global sovereign or bodies that can act, that have recognized authority to do so, we simply won't be able to enforce any agreements that we make. And the eighth concern is also related. It's difficult to see how we would sanction non-compliance, especially in the case of very powerful states. So if we forge an agreement and powerful states don't play their part, how will we actually enforce that? How will we sanction non-compliance? So this is a partial list of sources of unease, but I think it's a powerful set, I think. Nevertheless, I think I can sketch important responses to all of these concerns. And I think one of the key ways in which we need to go in this direction is to show what is actually possible in various domains of public policy, which I do in much more detail, obviously, in the book. So we need to look at actual cases, what's possible in particular domains. Here I will just have space to talk about one very slight and partial case study, and I've chosen to talk about taxation and accounting arrangements in the global sphere and what's possible in terms of change and what the problems are there. So I think this will give you an illustration of the kinds of strategies that I deploy. So just some background. I think it's quite easy to avoid, or it seems to be quite easy to avoid paying taxes in the global sphere. If you think about the vast numbers vast amounts of taxable income that escapes taxation, an amount equivalent to about 1/3 of global domestic product, effectively is beyond the reach of taxation. It's further estimated that about half of world trade goes through tax havens, which allows profits to be shifted to places where taxes can effectively simply be avoided. And this is managed through various complex financial schemes, such as transfer pricing, where multinationals typically disguise the true cost of the production and the true cost of the price of sale, and therefore report or seem to incur a loss when in fact they're incurring profits. And typically losses don't attract taxation. So this very skillful way of disguising profits lets multinationals get away with not paying taxes. This is a huge problem, and it's a much greater problem than many people are aware. So people think foreign aid is an important requirement for developed countries to assist developing countries, but in fact, for every dollar of foreign aid that is given to a developing country, $67 of corporate tax evasion flows out of a country. So this is just to give you a sense of the scale of the problem. There's massive amount of tax escape out of these countries. Tax evasion threatens both development and democracy in very fundamental and important ways. Because large corporations are failing to pay their fair share of sustaining communities, the tax burden is often shifted onto smaller businesses and ordinary taxpayers, and they have to foot the bill, with the result that vastly reduced sums are collected, insufficient to achieve minimal goals of social justice, which can undermine the community in general and enfeeble people's support for it, thus undermining support for the government and making many states very unstable. Also, because many developing countries are in competition in trying to attract foreign capital, many think that the way to do this is to offer tax concessions, tax havens, and the like. And basically, multinationals play one of these jurisdictions off against another, trying to get the best tax deal. Who loses? Well, the developing countries, as they compete. So we have who wins is the corporations because they pay no taxes. Developing countries don't have the facility to collect funds from them. And again, ordinary citizens and small businesses have to pick up the tab. I've mentioned that the use of tax havens is an important way in which tax evasion can occur. And economic activity is often falsely declared as occurring in places where taxes are low, rather than accurately recording where it happens. And this one of the vehicles for doing this is transfer pricing. There's more about that in the paper and the book. I won't go through examples, but basically the idea is to disguise profits so that taxes are not paid. Now, this is a huge problem. We think that this might, what's the scale of this? Well, approximately 60% of all world trade happens within multinational corporations. And 50% of all world trade passes through tax havens. So 50% of all world trade is escaping taxation. That's a vast amount of tax escape. Another problem with our global taxation and accounting arrangements is that we uphold many cases of double standards, that in the developed world we require certain things of multinationals which we simply don't in other parts of the world. So one example is disclosure requirements on the sale of assets. This is a requirement in the developed world. One must declare how much you pay for assets, especially natural assets, resource sales. But this is not a requirement in the developing world. Okay, now why is this a problem? Well, in many cases, large parts of the state budget are made up from resource sales, and if that revenue was received, it would be more than enough to function basic requirements for a just state. However, with the non-disclosure of the resource sales, this simply provides an opportunity for corruption and for various people to siphon off the profits of these resource sales rather than helping those to go to the citizens in those countries. What we need to do is help citizens within those countries keep their leaders accountable, and requiring the same standard as we do in the developed world, where we require disclosure on asset sales, would be one mechanism where we help those people in those developing countries help themselves to keep their leaders accountable. They need that kind of information. So I think more transparency in payments made to less developed countries would certainly reduce opportunities for corruption and could ensure that payments made for these resources actually benefit the citizens of countries. Now, companies can be made to publish what they pay in various ways, and we could do this by, say, linking it to desirable organizations. So we could make it a requirement that all corporations that list on major stock exchanges, such as New York or London, must adopt the transparency practice. We have a number of pressure points in the developed world where we can put pressure usefully on those companies to do what they recognize is the right thing to do within developed countries. What else can we do here now to solve these kinds of problems? We could develop systems of unitary taxation for multinationals to stop the entirely false shifting of profits to countries with low or no taxes. We could promote cooperation among states to reduce the destructive effects of tax competition. Now, you might think, oh, these reforms are just completely infeasible. Well, I think it's worth pointing out that not only are they not infeasible, they're actually happening in the sense that we have some bodies in place that are starting to work on these problems and coming up with some important proposals. In fact, since 9/11, there's been quite a lot of interest in phasing out loopholes in taxation because of the way in which this can assist the financing of terrorist organizations. So there's lots of support for international transparency. And for instance, we've got the OECD body, the Global Forum on Taxation, which provides just the kind of forum for the exchange of ideas on taxation that I'm talking about. And it has produced some tangible results, such as they have developed some proposals for unitary taxation formula that, if implemented, would put a stop to the most egregious forms of transfer pricing that I am worried about. Okay, so we will talk about the feasibility skeptic in more detail later. I just wanted to introduce that case study so that I can draw on it in the kinds of strategies we might then be able to use to rebut the nationalist skeptic and the feasibility skeptic. So let me talk a little bit about the nationalist skeptic now. I think if we're aiming for a vision of global justice that can be a realistic utopia, we have to take account of people's national aspirations, whether we like it or not. So just sort of remaining neutral on that question, we must take account of people's national aspirations. And the way in which we do that matters. So I think my model of global justice can do this in making space for legitimate national aspirations. And the strategy that I deploy in trying to show how this is the case is to show how the framework for global justice that I build, especially around global governance, would actually make more space for national aspirations to flourish, for nations to flourish in a meaningful way by enabling their self-determination and enabling and empowering them to enjoy more of the goods they care about. So, we want to make sure that their nationalism can flourish, then they need to opt for more global governance of the right kind. So how does global justice, my account, do this? Well, let's just reflect now on those tax reform proposals I was talking about a moment ago. If they were implemented, this would allow all states to collect more of the revenue that they're owed. If everybody is paying what they ought to in terms of their taxation, every state will benefit. Every state will be able to collect more of the revenue that they're owed, and which is currently simply lost to them through these widespread practices of tax escape that are perfectly legal today. So that's a case where, rather than inhibiting self-determination, such tax reforms would enable nations to have more resources at their disposal with which they could promote their goals, including those deemed important to a nation. So there are many other cases throughout the book where I try to show that through drawing on policy cases. I also show that more responsive forms of democracy are possible when you have in place a global governance environment which allows more responsive democracy more generally. One of the goals of global justice is to ensure that people's basic liberties are protected. And anyhow, we would want as a requirement that any nationalism that we support shows adequate respect for people's basic liberties. How can we do this within, in the international community? How can we enable people within states to better protect their basic liberties? I think there are a number of key institutions that can allow us to do this and that play a central role. And in the book I talk more about how press freedom is a key vehicle by which we help states to help themselves to keep each other accountable. So press freedom allows allows for more opportunity for us to air grievances, to bring to light information about how basic liberties are being infringed and so forth. So press freedom is one important institution that we as outsiders can help promote. Another institution that we as outsiders can help promote is the whole architecture of international justice, such as we do when we support the International Criminal Court. So I think there's much that we in the international community can do to help states to help themselves to support and strengthen their own national their own self-determination and running their affairs in a manageable way. Okay, there's lots more to say about that. I'm going to move on in the interests of time. My basic claim is that we should respect nations so long as they are discharging all their responsibilities. Nations have both internal and external responsibilities. They have internal responsibilities to respect their citizens, and they have external responsibilities to contribute to the project of ensuring a just world. When they're doing both adequately, then they should be given all the autonomy they like and to be as self-determining as they like, so long as they are respecting their citizens appropriately, discharging their internal responsibilities, and contributing to what's required in terms of global justice as well. Okay, I'm going to, in the interest of time, leave the nationalist skeptic and go back to the feasibility skeptic again. I think the feasibility skepticism can be rebutted, and I've identified 8 different forms of feasibility skepticism, which I simplify into 4 key areas. One is about the goals, the second is about how to transition to global justice, a third is about measurement, how we know we're actually going in the right direction, and the fourth set of concerns, and I think probably the most difficult set of concerns, has to do with motivation to pursue global justice, especially in an environment that seems to include no or inadequate global authority. The goals of global justice I argue for in the book, and I've outlined already. I think that they're reasonable ones to have, and I think we would get widespread agreement for them, and I argue for that in the book in more detail. Let me slow down a little bit with the transition worry and say a bit more about that. I think it's become quite fashionable to express ignorance, or perhaps more charitably, humility about what will help the global worst off, especially in helping them to escape poverty. And I think some of that humility, if you like, is quite appropriate. But I think in the rush to say we don't really know what works, I think we are ignoring some of the key mechanisms that we know to be beneficial. And so here my strategy would be, well, there's certain things we know will help, and so we should at least put our energy into those. So let's talk about some of those. Of course, having good institutions in place, especially within a state, is key. We want to make sure that there are good institutions in place, especially institutions of governance. And often the worry is that as an outsider, there's a very limited role to play in securing those institutions of good governance within the state. Actually, Mathias has argued some of this previously. Maybe he's reneged on that. And so what can we as outsiders do? I think plenty. We can help support an environment of good governance by promoting and encouraging a culture of accountability, by fortifying the hand of international justice, by supporting local institutions that promote freedom of expression within a country. Those are key ways in which we can help promote this culture of accountability, even if we're not actually physically in that country. We can do plenty, I think, without being there as outsiders. There's plenty we can do in terms of tax reform. So by implementing the kinds of tax reforms I've been suggesting, we will enable countries to collect more of the revenue they're owed. The disclosure requirements that I'm suggesting are needed, again, promote accountability and promote an environment in which citizens are given information about the sale of assets, which they can then press their leaders and say, well, what have you done with that? And so forth. So, yes, there's plenty to say about, well, we don't know what works and what doesn't, but in that debate, we should not underestimate our state of knowledge about what will help those most in need of assistance. And I think there's plenty that we can still do that we know will be effective. The measurement issue, I think there are plenty of empirical measures available to show and to help us keep track of whether we're making progress in the right direction. I won't talk about that. I'll go straight on to the motivation issue, which I think is kind of the hardest. And here, I think there are several layers of response we can offer about the motivation issue. And I think together they should suffice to allay some of the most worrisome aspects. So the first layer of response I would offer has to do with how far self-interest can take us. I don't think self-interest can take us all the way, and I'm not even suggesting that it can, but I think self-interest can take us some distance. So I don't think we should underestimate the role self-interest can play here. So for instance, I think we all have an interest in ensuring there's an environment of accountability everywhere in the world, because where there's lack of accountability, all sorts of threats to our interests can thrive. And of course, the usual ones that are mentioned here, threats to our collective security are often mentioned, include threats posed by organized crime, terrorism, arms trading, money laundering, and so forth. So we all have an interest in ensuring everybody's held to account, and that can be a significant reason why we should care about accountability in other countries. I also think the taxation and accounting reforms that I've been suggesting can take us some distance. So the kinds of proposals that I'm suggesting would allow all states to collect more of the revenue they are owed. And this is something that everybody has an interest in. Every state has an interest in collecting more of the revenue they owed. So there's no conflict there. Okay, so those are the kinds of cases where I think self-interest should motivate at least some kinds of action. We all have an interest in certain things, and those are the ones that at least we should focus on then. Okay, the second kind of concern is, a second kind of layer of response to the concern is what we can do with skillful institutional design. I think we can also harness the power of interlocking and linked incentives by creating institutions that create incentives and create a framework for enforcement as well. So we could make it a requirement of membership and participation in desirable organizations such as the World Trade Organization, that organizations adopt the transparency practice and adopt these requirements about taxation reforms. We can also require that they, as a condition of listing on various major stock exchanges, that they conform with these sorts of practices. Linkage can then provide a useful mechanism for what to do about non-compliance, because penalties can then be implemented through the linked organization. A third layer of response is to tackle one very big myth that operates in this area, and that is that unless we have universal agreement, no progress is possible. So there's this kind of myth, I think, that lurks in the background that unless we have universal agreement, we just simply won't be able to make progress, and I think that's simply false. There's plenty of areas where we can make progress without universal agreement. So think about the way in which the International Criminal Court only has about 105 states that are signatories. That hasn't stopped us proceeding with the core business and bringing perpetrators to justice in the case of those states that are signatories. And also, we shouldn't underestimate the power of momentum. Once there's an initiative that's up and running, citizens often could put pressure on states to join, and the international community can do so as well. Those who are not part of an initiative often lose influence in related policy areas. I think reflecting on changes over the last 100 years, it's not irrational to hope for more global justice, and especially in the face of a lack of universal agreement. So we've made advances in many areas where there were initially great setbacks, where we had nothing like the support of even a majority. So some of the cases would be the eradication of smallpox, or mandating double hulls in oil tankers to prevent toxic spills, tsunami warning systems. There's plenty of cases where initially there was very little support, and yet through perseverance we managed to get on side a pretty much universal agreement. So even in the face of initial setbacks and the initial appearance that a universal agreement is hopeless, it's still worth pursuing because we can actually make meaningful progress in the absence of it. And second, we may actually get more people on side as we go along. A fourth worry is about the theoretical difficulties. Sometimes we think, well, there's so many theoretical difficulties with this, it simply won't work. But, and this is the response, what might not work in theory can sometimes work reasonably well in practice. So for instance, I argue for a system of global governance that's diffuse and overlapping with multiple sites of accountability, multiple sites of authority for various domains. It looks like it's going to be messy to implement. How will we actually implement anything? But in fact, we have a system of global governance that is exactly like that. If you think about all the organizations that have authority in various domains and have overlapping authority, the United Nations, World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, and the like, they all have authority over various domains. And in fact, it works reasonably well in practice sometimes. The question isn't how to create such a system of global governance. It's more how to reform what's already there to make it more legitimate. So we have a concentration of power, and the question is, can it be exercised more legitimately, rather than can we create such a thing? So I think by demanding more legitimacy of powerful institutions, we can make gradual progress. How will people come to demand more legitimacy of these powerful organizations? Well, here consciousness raising has an important role to play, and so I think there is some scope for this idea, this project of world citizenship, education for world citizenship, which I say something about in the book a little bit. If people come to see themselves as global citizens, to at least see themselves as part of a global community and care about the global problems, this can actually help them see why they should care about solving some of them. I also think this will actually be key to creating the necessary political will for leaders, domestic leaders, to care about taking up some of these initiatives as well. So I think I'm pretty much going to be out of time. Just to sum up then, I think what I've done in this paper is respond to two key kinds of criticisms that people can anticipate will be issued to any global justice project. And insofar as I've at least started to sketch some responses to them, I hope to have begun to provide some kinds of resources to leaders on global justice matters that they will need to have. Thank you.
Thanks for two excellent presentations. Maybe we have Gillian and Mathias peers who heard about grounds of justice and grounds for skepticism and ground for optimism and ground for pessimism. So surely there must be questions for both of you.
So I have a question for yes, I agree with a lot of your conclusions. I was just wondering, I want to ask you a bit more about the structure of your view regarding accountability. So, at one point you say that accountability, if I'm not mistaken, accountability